Hello, students. If you don't mind, you can try to move to the center aisle. Thank you. Okay. Right, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the NTU Distinguished Lectures in the Humanities Series. Now, before we start the session proper, just a couple of housekeeping matters to note. Firstly, we have a Q&A session at the end of the lecture. And for our audience who have joined us remotely, you can either scan the QR code that you see on screen to access our Slido event link, or simply visit slido.com and key in the numerical code. Now, this option is of course available to all of you here at the auditorium as well. Secondly, to ensure a positive experience for everyone here today, we would appreciate if you can switch your mobile phones to silent mode. Thank you. And with that, allow me to present Professor Ben Rampton, who will be speaking on the topic of localizing linguistics citizenship. Professor Rampton is a professor of applied and social linguistics at King's College London, who works on interactional social linguistics with interests that covers urban multilingualism, youth, ethnicity and social class, conflict and insecuritization, as well as language education policy and practice. Prof. Rampton, please.
Well, thank you very much. Let's just get the microphone. Right, is that okay? Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for having me here. I can't tell you what a good time I've been having in the last week. I'm not going to say it's been leisurely, but it's been extremely interesting. And thanks to Luke Liu here for all the organisation. Congratulations to all the students for being so good and so interesting and so engaged and engaging. And it really is I've had a great week. That's the first thing that I'd like to say. What I'm going to talk about, well, over the last 20 years, the idea of linguistic citizenship developed by Christopher Stroud and colleagues has been spreading from Southern Africa, where it started, and there have been discussions about the relevance of linguistic citizenship not only in Southeast Asia, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam and so forth, but also in Europe, in Austria, Singapore, Thailand, wrong bit. My geography is better than that. In Europe, in Austria, Sweden, Spain and England. Within these discussions, I think that the question of localization has to be prominent for at least two reasons. First, Stroud says that linguistic citizenship is an attempt at a comprehensive political stance on language. Well, if it's political, then I think we need to reflect on the relevance of this concept to the particular political arrangements in specific places. And if it's comprehensive, we ought to consider theory and practice, reflection and action, across a range of settings in locations that we know fairly well. Second, Stroud and colleagues say quite emphatically that linguistic citizenship is a southern and decolonial concept arising from the contradictions surrounding educational programs in the geopolitical South. So how's it going to be relevant to a rich country like England? Well, here is a slide of what I'd like to cover in what follows. So you can see it there. So after describing what I think linguistic citizenship means, I'll try to embed my own interest in linguistic citizenship in account of language and politics in England, and go on after that to describe something of the kind of multi-layered language development program that linguistic citizenship seems to call for. I'll move back and forward in what I say between the abstract and the empirical, offering first a bird's eye view and then a worm's eye view. And it's inevitable that parts of my talk will sound a bit parochial, but I hope that there may be points of connection in the local case that I'm going to allow, and it'll be very interesting to hear what you think of the overall scope of what I'm going to say. So let's start with a definition. Stroud and colleagues begin their account of linguistic citizenship with a critique of the linguistic human rights approach to linguistic inequality. Now, this is a very state-centered approach that's been influential in post-apartheid South Africa, where Stroud and et al. Are based. And in it, what's the right distance? If I get too close like that, it's too close, isn't it? So is this better? Yeah? This is better. Okay. In this linguistic human rights approach, there is selective provision for specific groups, and this is often designed to overcome historic disadvantage. The group's distinctive language is identified, described, and introduced as an entitlement in institutional activities, in schools, law courts, aspects of state bureaucracy, and it's the courts and other bodies overseeing the nation-state that grant and monitor all this. Now, this thinking underpins the recognition of 11 official languages in South Africa, but there are also a number of problems. LHR promotes an essentialist view of language and ethnicity. It creates artificial boundaries between ways of speaking that are actually continuous, and it overlooks mixing and hybridity. As a result, LHR marginalizes people who use non-standard versions of the group's language, generating new sociolinguistic inequalities. And it appeals to a rather top-down and managerial politics. It presupposes membership of a single state, and it neglects population mobility. It isn't well adapted to the fact that individuals now find themselves participating in a variety of sites in competition for resources distributed along multiple levels of scale, such as the nation-state, the supranation, the local and the regional. In Lionel Wee's formulation, a rights discourse has the unfortunate effect of freezing group relations and privileges, while in reality, socio-cultural differences and inequalities are constituted by ongoing and ever-changing processes of struggle as individuals, qua individuals, as well as qua group members, strategically utilize available resources to maintain, enhance, or transform their various life chances. Putting it another way, the advocates of this approach talk to government with a sociolinguistic map that rather distorts the ground that it's supposed to cover. Instead of this, says Stroud, we need an approach that is better tuned to sociolinguistic realities. And here is how Stroud characterizes the linguistic citizenship perspective. The LC, the linguistic citizenship perspective, sees all sorts of practices, linguistic practices, including practices that are mixed, low status, or transgressive, as potentially relevant to social and economic well-being. It accepts that it's very hard to predict any of this if you're just watching from the center. It puts democratic participation first and emphasizes cultural and political voice rather than just language. It stresses the importance of grassroots activity on the ground, often on the margins of state control, outside formal institutions. And finally, it argues that an enhanced understanding of sociolinguistic processes should be central to emancipatory politics. Okay, so that's Stroud's theory of linguistic citizenship, developed in Southern Africa. How far and in what ways can it be transferred to a wealthy country like Britain in the global north? Can we really appropriate it in England? And if we think we can, what could this localizing of linguistic citizenship actually look like? Well, I'd like to begin with a broad overview of language and language education in England. Is it also completely different from South Africa, that Stroud's ideas are simply irrelevant? Here are some figures from the latest national census. 2021 in London, 40.6% of the population was born overseas. 57% of new babies had a non-UK born mother, and this diversity is spread far beyond just urban centres. It's reckoned that about 20% of English primary school children use a language other than English at home. And to give you a more vivid picture of this, let's just look at one school, one London secondary school's efforts to provide for this diversity with some extra Portuguese classes. Here's the statement from the school's website. We also enter students for GCSE and entry-level qualifications in community languages. Native speakers of Portuguese, Bengali, Arabic and Turkish, amongst many other languages, have the opportunity to gain a qualification in their mother tongue. Sam Holmes, though, took a closer look at these Portuguese classes, and he found that the situation was a bit more complicated. The students in the GCSE class who had Portuguese as a home language were mostly European Portuguese, and there were also because they were mainly European Portuguese, because Brazilians at the school tended to arrive in the country at older ages and were already literate enough to pass the exam without formal study. There was also one Polish and one Palestinian student with good language skills. In fact, when Sam carried out a survey of 58 Lusophone descendant people, only 10.6 actually recorded the exclusive use of Portuguese at home. Digging a bit deeper, it soon also became clear that home language didn't guarantee stress-free participation in the lessons, and there are some of the comments that he encountered. The label Portuguese actually covered a range of different ways of speaking, tangled up with all sorts of conflicting assumptions and beliefs. And referring back to Stroud and colleagues, it looks as though this school was working with the kind of reductive and simplifying view of language and ethnicity that they associate with the linguistic human rights perspective, overlooking mixing and hybridity, potentially generating new sociolinguistic inequalities. But we should not be too quick with criticism, because in the context of educational provision for languages and multilingualism in England more generally, these Portuguese classes were actually rather progressively heterodox. So, in the words of the British Academy's call for action, there has been a drastic and continuing decline in the numbers studying languages at secondary school, and consequently at university, especially over the past 2 decades. This has produced a vicious circle in which fewer teachers are trained, with the result that provision and uptake at school are further damaged. Vis-à-vis community languages like Portuguese, there is a disconnect between mainstream education and community-based language learning. The language learning that goes on in thousands of complementary or supplementary schools in the UK has little public visibility. It's scarcely ever connected up with the learning done by the same children in mainstream schools. Turning it around and looking at the provision of English teaching for people who use other languages, the situation is just as dismal. There's no national provision for English as an additional language in schools, no curriculum guidance, no teacher education. For adult migrants, provision is generally very fragmented. Demand for ESOL far outstrips supply, and national funding has been cut by 60% since 2010. Now, this does not mean that the British state is completely indifferent to multilingualism, or indeed that it keeps language and citizenship totally separate. But the links it makes are rather different from Stroud et al.'s. And a lack of proficiency in the national language, immigrants need to learn English, says central government, for social cohesion and national security. And a lack of proficiency in the national language increases the threat of radicalization and terrorism, particularly among Muslims. So according to Theresa May, Home Secretary, and then the Prime Minister, and I'll let you read this, I can't bear to read it myself. So, returning then to the comparison with South Africa, yes, we've got a linguistically heterogeneous population, indeed, as many suggest. There's a South also that exists in the global North, in the form of excluded populations. But if anything, England sounds rather less receptive to multilingualism. And on top of that, the government is explicit about making Brexit Britain a hostile environment for migrants across a range of policy areas. So there's a good case for saying that arguments in favour of recognising multilingualism as an asset actually need to be stronger in England than in South Africa. Okay, then what forces and resources are there available to contest central government's entrenched and indeed aggressive monolingualism? Let me mention 4 and then situate linguistic citizenship among them. First of all, there is civil society, as mentioned in the British Academy report. Undaunted over 50 years by the stances adopted by successive governments, there is still a huge array of relatively small-scale local and community organisations and initiatives dedicated to cultivating heritage language multilingualism through arts and education. Evans and Gill and Thomas reckoned in 2015 that there are about 3,000 to 5,000 supplementary schools in England, and although they generally run on very little money and have a low national profile, it's important not to underestimate them. In the 1970s, for example, a report funded by supplementary school parents about the disproportionate allocation of West Indian children to special schools, the Cord report had a major impact on the debates about multicultural education. And in fact, it led in time to another resource for contesting the current state of affairs, and that is historical experience. Stroud and colleagues sometimes talk sometimes suggest that we'll only ever find the cultivation of heteroglossia at the margins of state provision. But a brief glance back to English state education half a century ago shows that that isn't actually true. From the 1960s to the 1980s, schooling in England was dominated by progressive pedagogies, and local authorities, teaching unions, and subject associations had much more influence over the curriculum than central government. In language education, there was huge interest in the voice and the language repertoires of pupils, and for many, this brought the politics of gender, class, and ethnicity into lessons. In the late 1980s, a lot of this culminated in the Language and the National Curriculum project, which ran from 1989 to 1992, involved 25 coordinators, more than 10,000 teachers in over 400 training courses, supported by £21 million from central government. That's equivalent to 165 million at current values. So you can see some of the project's core values on the screen, and the similarities to Stroud's linguistic citizenship should be clear. I won't read it out, but just take a second to have a look. Well, admittedly, the training materials that this LINK, it was called LINK, project produced were eventually banned, with the Conservative minister responsible asking, why is so much prominence given to exceptions rather than the norm, to dialects rather than standard English? Of course, language is a living force, but our central concern must be the business of teaching children how to use their language correctly. Indeed, shortly after all this educational activity was replaced by a centralized national curriculum that prioritized standard English and a free market system that pushed schools and college managers to concentrate on exam results. But even though this central government legislation had a massive impact on schooling, it didn't close down on a third significant resource in arguments for linguistic pluralism, academic sociolinguistics. Academic research on language and post-war migration in Britain stretches back at least 50 years, and a lot of it is focused on education, often with quite a strong interest in using research to achieve practical effects. In the late 1970s, adult migrant language training provided a context for John Gumpert's highly influential sociolinguistic theory, development of highly influential sociolinguistic theory, and much more generally, during the 1970s and 80s, there was a lot of sociolinguistic interest in linguistic diversity in schools, colleges, and adult education, and this was fueled by very robust and energetic debates about multiculturalism and anti-racism, debates conducted among academics, community activists, parents, educators, politicians and officials in local and national government. As I've indicated before, none of this chimed with Thatcherism, and in the 1990s and beyond, successive governments closed the space for working with language diversity in education. But this shift in education policy didn't shut down academic interest in linguistic diversity, and there's now actually a very substantial literature on British multilingualism, covering, among other things, multilingual literacies, supplementary schools, popular culture, urban vernaculars, everyday interactions, all of it pointing to the everyday normality of mixed heteroglossic language practice. In addition, there are significant lines of critical sociolinguistic work that focus on public discourse and government policy, and document, for example, the racism and Islamophobia in the mass media and the insecuritization of British Muslims and migrants more generally. And this brings us, I think, to the fourth resource for countering this aggressive monolingualism, the universities. Universities are expected to play a significant role in their regional economies under a government-impacted agenda that affects quite a substantial part of their funding. And in fact, according to an OECD study of HE in 12 countries, higher education institutions are strongly placed to interpret global issues on a local scale. This process of regionalisation is itself potentially good news for multilingualism, because local organisations and local governments are often much better attuned to the opportunities and challenges presented by linguistic diversity, much better attuned than national institutions, and they're potentially more responsive, especially in urban areas where a substantial proportion of voters of the electorate are themselves multilingual. It also sounds as if HE pedagogies may be changing from a linear model of transmission of knowledge based upon the classroom to becoming more interactive and experiential, drawing on, for example, project work, work-based learning, placement opportunities and practical work outside the university seem to be a growing part of the higher education curriculum, at least in principle. And at least in principle, this increases the opportunities for students to spend time working locally in multilingual groups and institutions, bringing their experience outside back into the university classroom. So civil society, historical experience, academic sociolinguistics, and the engaged and impactful university are sources of opposition to English monolingualism. Of course, each of these is a complex field, and they don't all lead towards a unified endorsement of Stroud et al.'s conception of linguistic citizenship. In neoliberal universities, concept of the civic university and university social responsibility may merely serve a marketing agenda, and outreach programs get caught up in volatile processes of prioritization and internal competition for resources. Alternatively, the academic arguments for multilingualism may be state-centered rather than locally embedded, like Stroud's. The European Union's discourse about plurilingual citizens is very much focused on elite multilingualism involving named standard languages with unified codified norms of correctness embodied in grammars and national literatures. And the British Academy tends to echo these top-down perspectives, arguing, for example, that above all, language learning benefits British interests in security, diplomacy, and international trade. Even so, in the language teaching profession, there are quite a number of signs that Stroud-like ideas about vernacular multilingualism are being taken very seriously. In recent years, notions like translanguaging, debates about decolonization have been prominent in conferences for school teachers. Discussions about textbook-free, teaching unplugged, and teacher activism feature at ELT events. Radical poets like Benjamin Zephaniah and Michael Rosen give the keynote talks at British Council award ceremonies. And the Trinity College Exam Board also speaks about translanguaging and bilingual assessment, issuing material as well to counter the traditional bias in favour of native speakers. So people in England haven't completely surrendered to English monolingualism, and although the particular values associated with Stroud's linguistic citizenship, linguistic heterogeneity, democratic participation, voice, although these values may not be universally accepted among the forces of resistance to central government, they chime with a sensibility among language teaching that is actually quite widespread. And at this point, I'd like to move one step down in my account of localizing linguistic citizenship and turn now to practical actions to promote it. But before doing so, I ought to explain why me and my colleagues align with Stroud et al. Rather than, for example, the EU's version of standard language plurilingualism. There are, of course, strong arguments that teaching works best when it starts with what people already know, with where they're at. And democratic participation and voice are appealing political values. But our main reason for lining up behind Stroud et al. Is intellectual and academic. The idea of linguistic citizenship may be shaped by debates and priorities in South Africa, but it also draws on foundational debates and it also draws on foundational, theoretical, and empirical debates in sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology. Yes, okay. Linguistic citizenship may offer a political stance on language, but that doesn't cut it off from high quality scholarship. High quality scholarship and fair and effective political governance obviously aren't the same thing. Politicians have to reckon with a much wider set of pressures and contingencies than academics. But in the words of Del Hymes, one of the founding figures in contemporary linguistic anthropology, the higher goals of liberté, égalité, fraternité are actually served by the careful comparative study of communicative repertoires and practices, because this study prepares people to speak concretely to actual inequalities. Echoing this emphasis on the relevance of high-quality scholarship much more recently, Jan Blommert argued that no social cause is served by poor analysis. Only the best work stands a chance of making a difference. And here it's worth underscoring that although linguistic citizenship is a normative rather than a descriptive concept, stressing what should be rather than what is, Stroud and colleagues are themselves very well embedded in contemporary sociolinguistic research, producing first-rate academic analyses of their own. So, when linguistic citizenship criticizes the arbitrary and reifying models of language in the linguistic human rights perspective, it's building on an academic pedigree, it's building on an intellectual deconstruction of named languages that is now very much mainstream in sociolinguistic and linguistic anthropology. Yes, there's absolutely no doubting the ideological and emotional power and persuasiveness of the idea of a language like English, German or Bengali. But nowadays there's lots of research which challenges the belief that distinct language exists as natural objects. Instead, English, German, Bengali are cultural constructs, social and ideological constructions. Likewise, when linguistic citizenship prioritizes voice rather than language, it's building on widespread agreement that named languages are actually rather shallow and restrictive constructs when it comes to understanding how people really communicate. When people talk, they use all sorts of visual and bodily signs, and they're guided by the particularities of the genre and the activity, their background knowledge, their attitudes and expectations of each other. And even if you only focus on the linguistic ingredients, you soon see that the forms that people use are associated with a host of different groups and situations that range from the very local to the transnational. And you really can't capture these associations in a single name. Now, following on from these comments about academic pedigree, I'd like to move now to our own attempts to treat the notion of linguistic citizenship as a multidimensional program for language development. Since 2019, my colleagues and I have been working up a hub for education and language diversity at King's, collaborating closely with a non-profit adult migrant language teaching organisation, English for Action. And you can see a family resemblance to linguistic citizenship in our three guiding principles. Shared language is vital to social life, but linguistic diversity is also central, and both can be enhanced by education. Local conditions and participant perspectives really matter and can't be taken for granted. Theories and research can be powerful tools helping people to think differently. And here's a publicity flyer to point to a number of fronts on which we've been trying to carry these principles forward. But I'd like to talk about three of these arenas. First, there are ordinary classes in BA and MA programs where the academic pedigree in contemporary sociolinguistic and linguistic anthropology, the academic pedigree underpinning linguistic citizenship, more than meets the intellectual requirements of higher education. And this can be integrated with UK universities' current enthusiasm or emerging enthusiasm for service learning, project work, and student internships. The multilingual Manchester programme was the most impressive instance of this. It started as a set of practical projects for a second year undergraduate sociolinguistics class and grew to become Manchester University's flagship public engagement programme. But there are other examples around the country, and we now run a module about linguistic citizenship which combines up-to-date sociolinguistic research papers with weekly placements in non-profit language organisations. Teacher training is a second arena, and as I mentioned earlier, there's hardly any state support preparing language teachers to work in multilingual environments. But there are quite a lot of short courses offered by non-profit organisations, mainly for practising teachers. And in our partnership with English for Action, we've been running a series of half-day seminars, as well as a couple of summer schools, with the title Language Education and Linguistic Citizenship. Oversubscribed. Throughout this training, we found that, for example, the re-theorization of repertoire provided by Blomert and Bacchus has cut a lot of ice with teachers, and the idea of the total linguistic fact formulated by Michael Silverstein, an absolute kind of central figure in US anthropology, has proved extraordinarily resonant. We've represented the TLF, the total linguistic fact, like this. And it does two things. First, it challenges the separation of structure, functions, and culture that you often find in language teaching. And it says to teachers, okay, you might concentrate on grammar and vocabulary, gradually increasing their complexity, but all the time that you're together in the class with other people, you're exposing each other to the particular understandings of language in the world, and all the time you're being pressured to see yourselves as particular kinds of students and teachers, to line up behind particular kinds of authority, and so forth. Ideologies inescapable. And that's the first point. Second, the two-headed arrow between activity and ideology means that values and beliefs can be reshaped by what people actually do together. So teachers and students aren't irrevocably trapped in dominant ideologies, and there's scope for creative rearrangement in our models of the social world. Now, I think there's a vivid example of this kind of ideological reconfiguration in another concept we've been working with. This is in the last chapter of their book, Brokering Britain. Poitrel and Cook suggest that there is a marked difference between, on the one hand, seeing ESOL students as non-citizen outsiders who we assist to acquire the language and cultural norms of their adopted homeland, and on the other, seeing them as diasporic locals with their own linguistic, cultural, social, affective and other resources whose very presence reshapes the locality they live in. Indeed, it's actually very easy to engage in this kind of reorientation. In the average adult ESOL class, migrant English class, there are likely to be students who've been in London for 10 years as well as 6 months. And it's also very easy to see a lot of teachers as local people with diasporic links as well. And that releases classroom interaction from at least two ideological straitjackets. First, it releases classrooms from the equation of culture and expertise with just one language. And second, it releases people and classrooms from the idea that knowing more about the language's structures and functions means knowing more in general. Instead, if you think about a classroom as a gathering of diasporic locals, even though it really matters, English becomes just one thread in webs of knowledge and experience that the participants bring with them. And this frees up a far richer set of resources, links and differences for everyone to learn from. Referring back to the hub we set up, the TLF and diasporic local are both illustrations of the principles we share with linguistic citizenship. Theories and research can be powerful tools helping people to think differently. But again, like linguistic citizenship, we are mindful of the fact that local conditions and participant perspectives really matter and can't be taken for granted. And of course, we ourselves experience the constraints that these impose. It's not just universities that experience the reductive influence of neoliberalism. Neoliberal governance and restrictive top-down regulation exert a very powerful influence on state-funded language teaching. And in the words of an adult education teacher at one of our seminars, there's a lack of meaningful subject-specific staff development opportunities. A top-down approach is prevalent, along with a tick-box culture, cutting out dialogue-based, pedagogically focused teacher education with the potential to develop curricula and incorporate student input. As a result, if that's what it's like in the state sector, it tends to be non-profit, non-state, third sector organizations that are able to engage creatively with the pressures and opportunities of contemporary multilingualism. And for universities, this responsive flexibility makes third sector organizations potentially easier partners in any program broadly oriented to linguistic citizenship. But it's certainly not straightforward. Collaboration with non-profit organisations isn't a priority for universities, and the same goes the other way round. These two sectors operate on very different funding and organisational timescales. Work with non-profit organisations isn't well recognised in university promotion paths, and there's seldom any workload recognition. Academics working with third sector organisations usually do so unpaid in their own time, and this leads to an overdependence on individuals, jeopardising collaborations if those individuals move on or leave. Certainly, service and local engagement often figure prominently in university mission statements, but they're generally projectized and pursued in high-profile, world-leading challenges and competitions that are very different in spirit from the long-term, low-key conversations which build trust and sustainability, holding collaborations together. In fact, maybe this adds another dimension to the linguistic citizenship program that we've been trying to develop. Getting our own colleagues and managers to be more open, more grounded about links with non-profit grassroots organisations, whether or not they're focused on language. And practical steps for this potentially include making collaboration with the non-profit sector a departmental commitment, so that it's taken, for example, as a standing item on agendas and needs succession planning. Supporting long-term cross-sectoral relationships that don't depend on project funding and can be sustained in small-scale activities in grant-free periods. Building alliances with colleagues that thematise both the benefits and challenges of collaboration at staff forums and away days. Giving value in sites of staff assessment to activities like serving as a third sector trustee, occasional trustee consultancies, and so forth. I suppose, yes, admittedly, this is more about citizenship in general than linguistic citizenship, and in focusing on strategies for university departments like this, maybe I'm taking the process of localisation to a level of granularity that makes it irrelevant outside the UK. So I'd like to conclude with two questions at very different scales. First, a local question about institutional particularity. I've talked about promoting linguistic citizenship across at least 4 different sites: graduate and undergraduate university courses, teacher training, collaboration with non-profit language teaching organisations, procedures in university departments. I've mostly illustrated all of this with efforts that we've been making at King's and with English for Action, but I know for sure that in the UK we're not the only people doing that. But does this make sense now about Singapore? Any connections, actual or potential? Second, and more generally, it's obviously a serious mistake to underestimate the significance of legal and state-centred definitions of citizenship. These can have a major practical impact on the everyday lives of lots of people, migrants, refugees and asylum seekers included. And as I've said, in England, the British state embeds this legal citizenship status in highly restrictive ideas about language development. Mono rather than multilingualism, cohesion rather than plurality, obedience more than creativity. Set against this narrowness, we've adopted for Stroud et al.'s linguistic citizenship, which is much better adapted to the complicated realities of vernacular multilingualism, and which also chimes much better with contemporary scholarship in sociolinguistics. But how does our alignment square with what Stroud et al. Often say about linguistic citizenship being transformative, being a transformative concept, not just correcting injustice, but changing the structures that generate injustice? Well, we've suggested elsewhere that it is probably harder to talk about transformation in Western Europe than South Africa, where discourses of radical change have a lot more currency. So, does that mean that we're satisfied with just the utopian qualities that Stroud and colleagues attribute to their theory of linguistic citizenship? Does that mean that we're just enjoying its aesthetic or euphoric resonances, important though that is? Well, I hope not. I hope not. Ideas and commitments compatible with linguistic citizenships were materialized and pedagogically enacted system-wide across the education system in the 70s and 80s. And instead of taking a romantic approach and reading linguistic citizenship off particular fragments of discourse, I've talked about linguistic citizenship as a series of quite humdrum practical measures that we've been trying to implement in the concrete conditions of our own workplace. So, in my final act of localization, maybe we can align our appropriation of Stroud et al.'s linguistic citizenship with what Raymond Williams identified as the deepest impulse in adult education: the desire to make learning part of the process of social change itself. And from there, I wonder whether we can see linguistic citizenship as a small, unspectacular, but nonetheless practical contribution to what Raymond Williams called a long revolution, the rising determination almost everywhere that people should govern themselves, a lengthy, difficult, complex revolution that is nonetheless a genuine revolution, transforming people and institutions, continually extended and deepened by the actions of millions, continually and variously opposed by explicit reaction and the pressure of habitual forms and ideas. Maybe. There are some references. I think that takes us... Oh, I'm going back the wrong way. There you go. I think it's over to you now, Luke. Yeah? Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Ben, for this wonderful talk, giving insight into the situation in England and I suppose your view on how linguistic citizenship might have applied in the English context, looking at, what you have done yourself as well as your department at King's, as well as generally, different layers of social activism within England and so on, right? So we'll now, open the discussion to the floor, including those of you joining us from wherever you are in the world on YouTube. Any questions or comments to make?
Thank you, Ben. I'm not a sociolinguist, but I'm interested in something about learning language in a classroom or at home. So recently we have been interested in translanguaging, the topic about translanguaging and cross-language learning. So for instance, we are interested in knowing what is the pedagogical value of, let's say, using a stronger language in these second language classroom. So I'm just wondering what is your comment on that, and what is the status of translanguaging? Is it still quite negatively viewed as not suitable in let's say learning English in England or London? Thank you.
Yeah. I can't, answer the question about its pedagogic effectiveness. There are people who are much more deeply involved in education assessment than me, who do research on this. And indeed, as maybe as a sociolinguist, I wonder whether. Sorry. Not trying to drink the ink from my pen. I wonder whether, I sometimes wonder whether, as a, whether the notion of translanguaging has so many advantages over code switching and other traditional sociolinguistic concepts. But there is absolutely no doubt that it has a lot of resonance in language education. It really does. It's, when concepts move from the academy into professional circles, they lose a lot of their precision, and you're never going to keep control over what they mean, etc. And I think that translanguaging is a very powerful concept. And as I say, I was looking through the conference programs of the EAL Association for Schools and the Adult Migrant Language Professional Association. I mentioned Trinity College Exam Board. These are all using the term translanguaging. So my feeling really is that there is it's part of a groundswell of dissatisfaction with the ways in which things are run in the English education system at present.
Thank you, Ben, for really nicely summarizing the state of art for us. Since we are talking about localizing, I guess in the last 3 days, last week that you've been in Singapore, I'm just wondering if you have any feedback for us about how linguistic citizenship might have unfolded in Singapore, or if it is indeed possible.
Well, I think that's really putting me on the spot. I didn't know that I'd have to give a report and an evaluation in public after my 3 days. If I was wearing my inspector's hat, I would approach things differently. No, but it's a very good question. And, I do know that people in Singapore, Chris Stroud, a very good scholar, was obviously employed at the National University of Singapore and developed the ideas of linguistic citizenship in collaboration with Lionel Wee, so that I know that this is not a new concept in Singapore. I know that it's not a new concept, not the first time any of you guys have heard of it. But I also pick up that, well, it's not quite as, you guys don't have the kind of situation that we have with central government and languages in the UK, but policy on multilingualism is less fluid than imagined in Chris Stroud's version. And indeed, I read a rather interesting paper recently by Lou about reasons why, despite the academic arguments being put forward, state policy might be quite slow to change. Okay, but that's why I pay attention to, I stress the kind of local practices and what one can do in the spaces that one has. And again, I'm getting an extra $300 for this. Again, recently read a paper by Lou about an experiment with Singlish in a couple of secondary schools. Well, who knows where that leads? Who knows where Delheim said when people were talking about the impact of academic knowledge. You know, my university, there's always every week you get an email coming around listing the number of scholars that have appeared in the newspaper, in the news. Okay. And Delheim said, hang on, you know, are we aiming for 10 minutes of somebody's attention span on a Sunday morning? Or are we spending time with young people in our undergraduate classrooms who will, you know, really spend quite a bit of time getting their heads round, getting into the thinking that we're developing, and then may leave and go become lawyers, become teachers, become whatever, but take into that the kind of sensibility that they can pick up in an undergraduate class, for example. And so, you know, I think teaching this stuff is worth doing. It's worth continuing. And of course, there are forces, you know, beyond our control, but it doesn't undermine the value of it. And I suppose my question to you would be, you know, I gave that sketch of what we're doing in our department. Got a meeting coming up on March the 8th. It was cancelled because of industrial action in England. I mean, academics are so troubled by the neoliberalisation of education that we've been going on strike. But on March 8th, we've got a meeting where we're going to sit down and say, well, hang on, let's go around the room and see whether people are doing things outside their day job, and whether they think there might be ways in which, you know, being a King's academic could actually, you know, benefit the fact that you're a trustee, and vice versa. And well, we've got a sympathetic head of department who is kind of, you know, looking for new ways of maybe interpreting the impact agenda, and I wonder how much that kind of conversation happens. What scope there is for that kind of conversation here. So, the inspection hat is over to you rather than I'm not retaining it.
Okay, in terms of the kind of work we do, I've been teaching in this linguistic program now for 10 years, and I can say that compared to the first year student, when I asked them, how many of you speak English as a native language? Feel this hesitant. Now, the entire class will put up their hand, right? Because they have accepted that speak English is a legitimate form of language. But I think a lot of that is to the point that I would never use our own students as survey participants, because everything gets inflated. Positive attitude, highly motivated. I mean, so in terms of that, I think our bunch in LMS, all the professors, I think they have done a good job in creating a kind of sense of language ownership.
Well, you know, in the UK, this gets noticed. Central government does not like universities, and you know, culture wars, wokery in serious hostility to the humanities and social sciences in universities, in all sorts of ways. So you know, it's obviously not trivial if politicians are saying, we better watch out for this, don't like it, huh?
Yeah, we have a question at the back.
Hi, Prof. Ben. Thank you very much for the great talk. Very interesting. I guess I just want to share some thoughts that I have, and maybe yourself and maybe Prof Liu can, like, if you have anything to respond, that would be interesting. So I don't come from a socio-linguistic background. I don't even come from a linguistic background. I'm just kind of approaching this from an outsider's perspective. So I do research on like sexuality and gender in the Singapore context. And I think it's very interesting as a scholar, of Singapore and also studying Singapore, a scholar from Singapore and as well as, of Singapore context to, I think maybe thinking about what you said about like linguistic citizenship and all its contradictions and all its ground up practices and how we might think about how that may be applied to Singapore. I think the idea of like Singlish does come to mind as you all were talking about it. And something I'm thinking about is how might researchers of and from Singapore maybe theorize from Singlish as a linguistic standpoint, because I'm thinking that like all of us we live or we work within like global Anglophone academia, right? And so we write like that as well. And if we write in Singlish or if we theorize from Singlish, like there's a chance that people will not take that seriously, overseas, right? And not just that, I'm just thinking like what might it mean to theorize using Singlish as a linguistic standpoint, as a way to even work with theory, to do philosophy with Singlish? Like, is that possible? Is Singlish, and I don't mean to kind of recapitulate any assumptions or biases here, but is Singlish not complex enough as English, for example, or as standard English in being able to do theory with it? So that's just something that I'm just thinking about, and I would love to hear your views. Thank you very much for the very, very inspiring talk.
I think that no cultural practices are too simple to merit investigation. And that's the idea of the total linguistic fact. A linguistic practice might involve just a few words, but it's still being done in real life situations, and it's being done in particular activities, in particular ways, and you can't escape the ideology going on around it. If you privilege just the syntactic complexity of a particular form, a particular language or variety or style, if you privilege it, you're missing out on what's actually going on, because you have to look at ideology, activity, and structure together. And I think that what we can say about, my boast in interdisciplinary arenas is that with that formulation of the total linguistic fact, it's gone. Don't worry. With that formulation of the total linguistic fact, which is a wonderful encapsulation of 50 years of really high caliber linguistic anthropological work. With something like that, we can offer a set of tools and procedures for understanding the empirical processes of practice, of communicative practice, semiotic practice, cultural practice, better than anybody else. We can get into the details, and we find that we've been having back in the UK, we've been having really interesting conversations with people who scholars in international relations. How it is that people in international relations, which historically deal with governments and diplomacy and stuff, get interested in practice, that's another story. But the point is that they are now interested in ethnography and how people do international negotiations, how people get securitized and so forth. And we've been having really good conversations. We've been saying, because we've been going along and saying, well, look, why don't you make a recording of this? Why don't you make a recording of this, and then let's sit down together and look at what's going on. And I think that's actually, almost the magic. Well, that's an exaggeration. It's a strength of interactional sociolinguistics, we can say, that you can actually take any bit of data and just starting from there, work out all sorts of processes that are happening at different scales. Of course, you have to bring in knowledge from elsewhere, but you can still see large-scale cultural processes being enacted in the now, in here and now, between people that you've recorded. And I think that's a very an exceptionally powerful set of perspectives that we can offer to social science, and not just social science either, and not just social science, because things like these, playing a recording of things to teachers and saying, okay, let's spend a couple of hours listening to these 3 minutes or these 2 minutes from your classroom. It gets people into a very different mindset. If you just interview people, they'll come up with a patter. They'll come up with whatever talk the ministry's, whatever concepts the ministry's been circulating. But show them, play them stuff that actually happens. They'll see that what's happening isn't adequately reflected in the circulating discourses, and they'll be able to start to tune in with their own the kind of intuitions that their practical consciousness operates with. And so I think it's not just, I think these methods are not just useful in interdisciplinary discussion, they're very useful in work with non-academics. And that's not just me saying that. I mean, this goes back to Gumpertz's work 50 years ago. These are a set of very well-established procedures. Thank you.
Right, so we have a couple of questions from our international audience, one from Kurdistan, actually. So right now, EMI is on the rise, especially where we work in Kurdistan. As such, mother tongue language is perceived as threatened. How can we relate the concept or use it given the rise of EMI?
Well, I mean, I think it's it's important to work on different scales, on different platforms, in different discussions. There may very well be certain kind of collective actions that people need to do to address people with institutional power. On the other hand, the talk about translanguaging means that there may be space to bring Kurdish into English learning. And there are arguments that people learn better. I mean, there are academic arguments that people will learn English better where they can mix in other styles, other registers, other languages. But I suppose that linguistic citizenship isn't, it's not a concept like translanguaging. It's more, if you like, an orientation. It's more an orientation. I mean, okay, I'll be really parochial going back to the UK. I mean, I think over the last 15 years, I would say there's been a number of kind of developments. First of all, in Western Europe, the traditional multiculturalism didn't work, so we had the kind of notion of super diversity, which, as a parochial, local descriptive term, not saying that this is the first time in the world super diversity has ever been discovered, but it was a lived experience for me and scholars around. So that was a term that kind of provided an orientation to encouraged us to look differently at a set of empirical spaces where languages were being used. To get at what was happening, we kind of developed this notion of linguistic ethnography, which is a kind of mixture of linguistic anthropology and applied linguistics. I mean, in the US, I think linguistic anthropologists have historically anyway been quite, the boundaries between education and linguistic anthropology historically anyway have been quite strict. And so UK and Europe, we thought we need to have some kind of closer relationship between people who work with teachers in schools on practical problems and these wonderful ideas, these wonderful concepts that people have been developing in linguistic anthropology. So we kind of came up with linguistic ethnography. And I think that the notion of linguistic citizenship allows us to turn that sense of a social, cultural space, a super diverse social and cultural space, those tools for starting to probe at social processes, cultural processes, in ways that can speak both to academics and teachers and other professionals, linguistic ethnography. Linguistic citizenship provides a kind of a practical mission, a kind of normative program. It introduces the should in ways that are compatible with that broad reorientation. So it's not a tight theoretical. It's not a tight theory with a set of claims that can be falsified or refuted or developed in a more sophisticated way. It's a broad orientation. But I think it's consistent with the apparatus of sociolinguistics. And so to go back to your question, I don't think linguistic citizenship offers you tools and strategies for how to analyze or set up interactions in which Kurdish comes into the English class. But it does say, yeah, go for it. It's you're not alone. You're not. You're not wasting your time thinking about how you can change things in the ground that you have some control over. And so that's how I would see. I mean, Stroud and colleagues often talk about linguistic citizenship being associating with hope. Well, goodness, I mean, I'm not greatly into hope or whatever, but goodness me, we need it in the UK. I don't know what it's like where other people are, and so I think that's how I would I'd put it describe it as a kind of general action program, tuned to quite high level political ideals. That was a long answer, goodness me, sorry, to a question that was so succinctly formulated too.
We have a second one. So in the context of European universities.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I can really answer that question. I don't know that I can answer that question because I haven't looked at EMI in European universities, And if I was going to talk about it, my own way of talking about it wouldn't be so much in looking at policy documents or legislative programs and so forth, or indeed interviewing particularly. Well, I would want to look at a little bit of some recordings of people people doing stuff in English medium classrooms in universities, and see where it went, and you know what happened in terms of the hearability, the voice, how far different kinds of formulation, different choice of different languages actually seem to carry in particular situations. So I'm afraid that's a very evasive answer. I mean, a good and important question, but I'm not able to answer it.
We have a question.
Thank you, Ben, for your talk. So I have a comment and a question. So with this shift from the orientation of linguistic human rights to linguistic citizenship, from language to the emphasis on voice, is an emphasis on ownership and agency that, as you say, I think can have the power to shape communities of practices on the ground. It's something I really appreciate from what you've spoken about today. So I have a very, very practical question. I think higher education institutions are very well positioned to partner with nonprofit organizations. Something you mentioned in your talk, and as you also mentioned, there are lots of challenges that come with such a partnership. So I wonder if you could perhaps walk us through an example of a successful partnership that your institution has had with a nonprofit organization. Thank you.
Well, I can give you some autobiographical reflections.
Right.
I was, and in fact, on the initial screen, you saw that it was King's on one side and it was English for Action on the other. Mel Cook, with whom I work closely and teach courses with, was a trustee of this organisation, English for Action, which does stuff with adult migrants, but also does a lot of kind of community organising. So it's an activist organisation, and the teachers are called, teacher/organisers. So she was a trustee, and we did a funded research project, a Leverhulme high-profile, prestigious grant. We did a project on whatever, and then we included as a kind of appendix to be funded an impact project, which was developing multilingual pedagogies in ESOL classrooms. Okay, that was very good. But then I think I was something like her appraiser or something like that, and we got to talking about. We start thinking, well, she's been doing all this work for a long time. Why aren't we? Are we making enough of it in the work that we do? And so we started to think about how we could bring it into some modules, a module that we're doing. And yes, so we said let's put a placement in. And she's terribly well networked, so she started to put students once a week into these organisations. Then we started to formalise it. We said, okay, I'm senior. I'm quite a senior, high up person. So I said, well, why don't we? That lovely star with the lines going off. I did that. Okay, sometimes you invent these things. They really are invented. But we said we use it for various kind of conversations we have here or there, and we had little bits of money that we started pulling in here or there, and what worries me is that, and I also started to go part-time at King's, so I do 2 days a week working with English for Action. I run a conversation club, and I do work in a volunteer in an ESOL class. So the links are thick, but if I, kick the bucket or Mel goes, well, hang on, that's it. I think it ought to be a little bit more robust than that. Ultimately, in the UK system, in the 5-yearly reviews of research, we have something called an impact case studies, and I suppose we ought to get this stuff written up in scholarly journals so we can then say that this is research, and then look at all these practical outcomes. But goodness me, people who have done impact case studies that have been submitted in the big review process, they say it's a total nightmare because you have to go. I want everybody here actually to sign a sheet before you leave so I can hand it in as evidence. They have to chase around doing all sorts of stuff to get this dossier to show that they've really been doing it. That's not how anybody who's seriously interested and engaged with third sector organisations operate. It's a much more low-key day-to-day, it's friendships, collaboration like that. But it's still something that universities, departments could support, because often, 500 quid here, 500 quid there, little bits of money can be used. It's about flexibilizing. It's about flexibilizing impact, so that it's no longer just the £3 million project. World questions, king's answers is exactly how. Sorry, you better edit that bit out. But that's how the big bold golden bridges that gets prioritised in a lot of university thinking, and it's crazy. It's crazy. That's not you want an institution that really does have links out. I mean, wonderful stories from multilingual Manchester. Yaron Matras, extraordinary scholar. He had this class, okay, and he thought, I can't carry on doing the textbook stuff. I'm going to do the projects. And this went on for a few years. I went to the first conference that he organised, and there were people from health, people from local government, I think it was somebody from the police, local supplementary schools, coming to this conference, doing panels. Yaron didn't actually know them because these were contacts that had been made through the students. The students had often, local students from the locality. They had these ties themselves, and they'd been spending this time going out, and so it was. I mean, it was remarkable, and I think that's. We just have to think beyond. We just have to think a bit more about the people in our classes. We have to think a little bit beyond the assessment. Assessment, goodness me, aren't we? Don't we all over-assess things? But, and have a little bit of trust in both each other as colleagues and our students in their kind of their capacity to engage in the world around them. I think that's compatible with Stroud's mission. I'll tell you what. We've been doing a little bit of stuff with English for Action. We've been doing some action research project, and my colleagues are very interested in participatory pedagogy, which is kind of lines up with Paulo Freire. So I kind of did my Freire reading recently. I mean, I'd done it about 40 years ago, but I reread it recently, and I kind of started to worry because Freire talks about people who are in pretty rural workers who are really at the margins, And I started to think, well, yes, there certainly are some people in these ESOL classes. I mean, EFA does classes with the independent workers of GB and groups of Filipino cleaners and so forth. There are people who are, but there are also people who, there are kind of people who, quite settled. So I thought, can we really talk universally Freirean pedagogy with quite comfortable people? But then it clicked, and I thought, hang on, isn't there a case for saying that these language teachers in state institutions, there seriously is a way in which teachers, we should maybe start to think about them as kind of oppressed groups in some sense. I mean, in the UK, is it 40%? Is it 60% of new teachers leave the profession within 5 years? I mean, the signs of strain are absolutely, they're very obvious. And I wonder whether there's scope for Freirean projects of language teacher education. So that's, yeah. That was a little bit of a digression, but anyway, yeah.
Am I allowed to ask a question myself? Right, so you have characterized linguistic citizenship as an orientation, right? And the way I read it, it's also, I guess it can also be seen as a political stance in itself, right? That an individual actually undertakes. And then it's interesting that you also, refer to Raymond Williams and his characterization of the project as a long revolution. Okay. So I'm thinking if this long revolution, given your own experience in the UK, in the UK's context, right? So is this revolution actually failing, or do you see, it making some kind of headway against this state project of being hostile towards migrants and so on? Right? I say this because I've lived in the UK myself, right? Obviously, and 10 years ago when I was doing the PhD with you, I lived in this place called Slough. So Slough is this, fairly industrial place where lots of immigrants come, and the estate I was living in actually had no real British citizens. So most of the people living in my new build estate were migrants themselves. Right? So I didn't necessarily feel out of place. So lots of people from South Indian descent and came and lived in Slough, and I used to smell Indian curry being cooked for dinner every night. Okay, and this was 10 years ago, and I didn't feel out of place. The people that I interacted with were never hostile to me. In fact, very welcoming. And then after I left the UK, Brexit happened. Okay, and you mentioned Theresa May's quote on those kinds of policies that were beginning to be introduced by the Tory government and so on. And then it really jarred with the experience that I had just 10 years ago. So do you think this long revolution that you have been talking about, so is it failing? Is it likely to make any kind of headway?
Well, let's just get the quote right. Variously opposed by explicit reaction and the pressure of habitual forms and ideas. So Williams doesn't think it's a cakewalk. Okay, that's one thing. I did hesitate a little bit about including. Well, I didn't, but I did a little bit about including the quotation from Williams's Long Revolution because he's writing extremely subtle, complicated, multidimensional analysis of English culture over several hundred years, and indeed, the Long Revolution was 1960, so that's written almost more than half a century ago as well. But it came to me when I was reading a book by Hilary Wainwright about local government. And there is a lot of talk now about decentralisation. I mean, the degree of centralisation in British politics is in English politics, absolutely crazy. And I think there is very widespread recognition that powers, funding need to go out to regions, to cities. So that's one thing. That's the decentralisation, and Hilary Wainwright cites this process of decentralisation as very much part of the long revolution. I do think that the workability of audit and performance regimes, I mean, it's reaching breaking point, and I don't think it's simply unsustainable. And as I say, I'm astonished by how many. For a while I thought ESOL teachers, they're the only radical ones around. But then, you see the okay, they might not talk about Freire in secondary school teaching, but they talk about dialogic pedagogy, which is in many ways kind of comparable ideas. So I think there is a sensibility among education people doing education that is pulling against that the way education is currently structured. I also chose the Williams quote because even though he was writing a long time ago, he does offer us a set of really helpful concepts for thinking about culture and cultural change, structures of feeling, dominant formations, emergent, residual formations. It's a very helpful vocabulary for thinking about processes of cultural change. And, maybe most of all, because Raymond Williams' formative intellectual experience was in adult education, in adult education classes. And there's a collection coming out. I'm not sure whether there are a couple of collections of his writings about adult education. Had lots of interesting things to say about the problems that arose when the adult college that he was working in, I think, in Wales, hooked up with Cambridge University, and all the struggles when it became affiliated in their kind of outreach departments. So I can't answer your question with specifics, but I would say that it's still a relevant orientation, consistent with linguistic citizenship as an orientation.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have actually experienced that multilingual matters myself when I was a student in the UK. So I understand that in England it's mostly based very English, although there's a lot of migrants there. But then when I went over to Australia, it's very English as well. But then it seems like the population there has a lot of migrants, which is more acceptance. And then when I did my PhD study, it's based in Malaysia. So I'm wondering, because I'm quite familiar with the LHR and those type of things. In Malaysia, in the sense that the language shift is happening very drastically, especially among the younger generations. So there are two groups of people where those in the city, they want more to go into the dominant languages, whereas for the villages, the indigenous, they still want to fight on to go on the mother tongue. It's not very successful because due to lack of fundings. So a lot of pilot studies has been stopped. And then in Singapore, it's very into English, although the promotion is still going on, like in my research center, on encouraging the children to actually pick up mother tongue languages, in the sense that the dominant tongue languages and not so much on the dialects and all that. So what's your comment, Prof, on linguistic citizenship applying on all these contexts?
I mean, there I would I pass on that, because clearly, you know, Stroud and colleagues have been developed the concept in relation to language shift, heritage language planning and stuff, and they'll be talking much more explicitly about those large-scale policy issues than I'm able to, you know, the question marks. Well, exactly what do we mean by mother tongue? Really, you know. Okay, is the answer to the problems of people in the margins a matter of linguistic recognition? I mean, what happens if we think about voice? What if we think about voice? Well, actually, maybe it's a bit more than just language that's at stake. And I suppose I would say, the only thing I would say is, well, as long as people do some careful ethnography in those environments, and make sure that these notional languages aren't just tokens that politicians toss around here or there to keep various local leaders quiet. I mean, I suppose that would be the general orientation that linguistic citizenship offers. The implication of that is, of course, that I can't say anything specific to the particular situation that you're talking about. Yeah.
Any other questions or views? I think then that's it, right? So let's thank Ben for his time and for sharing his views with us. Thank you for coming to Singapore, actually. Thank you for coming to Singapore.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and you know, such an interesting set of questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll end the session, right? So thank you, everybody.